Hello and most welcome to 2044 of the series. We will today continue with a chapter from Iain McGilchrist's The Matter with Things. This is a continuation of 2041, chapter 23. And last time we ended with page 977. We talked about rhythm, how rhythm is a punctual, disjunctive, non-wave-like phenomena connected to the left hemisphere. It does not have the feature of wholeness. It is in itself fragmentation. One could call it fragmentation itself. The unconnectedness, disjunctiveness. And we compared also the linear idea, the idea of a line. Straight line with the curve. The curve is much more fractal, more complex, containing much more. It doesn't suffer only repetition. It is different, iterated rather than exactly repeated. It has the ability to change itself, to show differences, not constantly be the same. This is in fractality called iteration. Iteration! There are more complex rhythm that actually belongs to the area of the right hemisphere. Syncopated rhythms, not as repeatable or mechanical rhythms, are actually in the realm of the right hemisphere, of the right hemisphere. And there is a nice pointer in page 976 that mechanical regularity in the beating of the heart is a warning sign. Gets too repeatable, too mechanical. It is not functioning well. It's a sure sign of something happening. A cardiac arrest or something similar could be in the short future. There's also beauty in the curves. Nature do not show up the feature of absolute linearity. Instead, nature is rounded, changeable, different constantly. Constantly reinventing itself, making new things happen, advances. And where there is life, there is a sort of rhythm. Curves are much more complex, not as simple, cannot be produced by a machine. Defy determinism. They are not technically or Newtonianly predictable. I think you can see the difference, something that we discussed many times before. For instance, in connection with the books by Lee Smolin, and especially the one where he wrote together with Roberto Unger, taking up the cosmological fallacy. Cosmological fallacy is looking outside of the universe into the universe, taking a point of nowhere, having no origin, in free air, an origo without definition, floating freely, nowhere to be pinned down, unreal. So the predictable rhythm is an abnormity, not natural, as well as the classical laws of the Newtonian physics. Nothing that can be found in nature, but rather an illusory construction of the mind that doesn't really fit with anything. An illusory construction of the mind. An illusory construction of the mind. The illusion lies in that it could be a place outside of reality with no origin, which you don't have to place anywhere. You just put a point somewhere without defining it. That's called in Merleau-Ponty for subject in front of object situated in space. A sort of mistaken identity of reality, as old as philosophy itself. And I will continue to read on page 977. It's the penultimate paragraph. There is indeed something fearful, like the tiger's symmetry, about the straight line, which has so come to dominate our world in the last 100 years. I mentioned Hundertswasser's view that the straight line leads to the downfall of mankind. The downfall of mankind. Bergson seems to have seen that what he called intellect could only approximate the living curve that intuition could reach directly, like the tangents that approximate a circle without ever reaching it. He thought that analytic thinking has to try to approximate the findings of intuition by a series of short, straight lines. Short, straight lines that zigzag around its path, making it an endless series of corrections where intuition enters the line at one stroke. One stroke. Spirals and vortices bring order into being out of chaos. Out of chaos. Early Celtic and Teutonic cosmologies held that life emerges from a vortex, an idea also common to many pre-Socratic Greek philosophers. Anaximander moved away from the idea that there were some single primordial substance, such as Thales' water or later Heraclitus' fire, toward the idea that there was an indefinable something, a peyron. A peyron, a peyron. That expressed itself in an eternal motion which brought everything into being by a reciprocation of opposites. Reciprocation of opposites. A vortex is such a tension between opposing forces, specifically centripetal and centrifugal forces. Centrifugal forces. Thus, it both separates and combines. Later, Anaxagoras and Empedocles agreed with Anaximander that this motion is a vortex. Vortex. Indeed, according to Democritus, the cause of coming into being of all things is the vortex. The vortex is movement more generally than foundational. Foundational, foundational. The primacy of motion over stasis. The primacy of motion over stasis. At some deep level, reality requires both elements of motion and relative stasis. The wave and the particle, the continuous and discrete. However, if the continuous and the moving is best appreciated by the right hemisphere, the discrete and static is best represented by the left hemisphere. By the left hemisphere. By the left hemisphere. It would not be surprising, therefore, if we found that they are not quite symmetrical in ontological status, with the continuous being the ontological primary, albeit in reciprocal relation with the discontinuous. With the discontinuous. This primacy of union over division, however necessary division might be, is reflected in the fact that one can move from an extended whole in space or time to parts, though losing almost everything on the way, but not from the parts to the whole. This point of view, which we have associated with Bergson, has been advanced by many philosophers and was anticipated by Leibniz. Leibniz! Indeed, Leibniz denied that anything real could ever be an aggregate of parts. Quote, I believe that where there are only entities through aggregation, there will not even be real entities. To be brief, I hold as axiomatic that what is not truly one entity is not truly one entity either. One entity either. Good point of good old Leibniz. Similarly, Leibniz remarks that mathematical points even an infinity of points gathered into one will not make extension. So extension in space and extension in time cannot be constituted by aggregation of points or parts. Oh, indeed. Both of these ideas are expressed more eloquently by Bergson and by James, but my point is that they are not confined to a Bergsonian or Jamesian view. They are there in the European tradition well over 200 years previously and are mathematically correct according to Leibniz, the inventor of calculus. The inventor of calculus. And since a point is conceived as static, no matter how many of them you have, you can never get from a point or points to motion. To motion. How can one fail to see, says Bergson, that the essence of duration is to flow, and that one static element stacked on another will never result in anything that has duration. However, you may say a flow, while it cannot be made up prospectively from static parts, could have recognizable regions in it once it has come into being, can have recognizable regions in it once it has come into being. So when Bergson says We shall think of all change, all movement as being absolutely indivisible, indivisible. He does not mean that it cannot be retrospectively divided. But that such a division can apply only to the representation, not to the entity itself, whose essence is change, motion, flow. His point is that the representation has lost the very element, duration or extension, that is the essence of what it tried to capture. For once, time or motion is retrospected on. It is no longer time or motion, no longer time or motion. In attempting to account for a pure process of change analytically, we can do so only by reducing it to parts time and again, until at last we reach something that no longer changes, but at the very moment we exclaim, "Finally, I have it!" We have, by definition, only immobilities, and from them no change can ever emerge. No change can ever emerge. The change we were trying to account for must forever elude our grasp. Elude our grasp. Elude our grasp. Elude our grasp. If change, which is evidently constitutive of all our experience, is the fleeting thing most philosophers have spoken of, if we see it in only a multiplicity of states replacing other states, we are obliged to re-establish the continuity between these states by an artificial bond. But this immobile substratum of mobility, being incapable of possessing any of the attributes we know. Since all our changes recedes as we try to approach it, it is as elusive as the phantom of change it was called upon to fix. It was called upon to fix. As for metaphysicians' attempts from Zeno onwards to account for motion and change, Bergson says that of change, they retained what does not change, and of movement, what does not move. All motion requires both a following and a headwind. It requires resistance, some degree of friction. If everything moved in the same direction at the same speed in a frictionless universe, this would effectively be stasis. Motion is always relative to something, always relative to something. Since there is no framework by which one element can be granted fixity, it is thus always a matter of both, or all, parties moving, never just one. A defining quality of all living things is that they move purposely. Growth being a form of motion, indeed. And we have seen that in order merely to remain in existence, they need constantly to change, to change. Aristotle recognized that locomotion is only one of four types of movement. One of four types of movement. The other three being growth, decay, and change of state, metamorphosis, all of which are present in plant life. Animals, unlike most plants, are locomotive and spend a great deal of their often costly energy in moving, sometimes over very large distances. Motion is important to continuing life, if nothing else. But it is more important even than that, as I shall suggest an irreducible facet of being itself. Earlier, I considered a particular kind of motion which followed logically from the discussion of time, namely the motion of flow, and how it represents both continuity and discontinuity together. Together, together. This is, I believe, of some philosophical importance. Now, I want to broaden the discussion to consider the grounding role of movement in general. The grounding role of movement in general. First, we should explore the role played by motion in grounding all aspects of our mental life. Motion and cognition. Motion and cognition. Indeed. Our knowledge is derived from action and interaction with the world. Before we have language or concepts, we are navigating and manipulating the world, solving problems, making decisions, and coming to an understanding of not just the world, but ourselves, purely through moving about in it. In a letter to Nature in 1887, Francis Galton takes issue with the philologist Max Muller's idea that thinking depends on language. He makes 2 points that are relevant here. One needs to be mentioned only in passing. Only in passing. In suggesting that Provence at chess owes nothing to language, he remarks, I myself cannot conceive that the names king, queen, etc. are of any help in calculating a single move in advance. In advance. In advance. For the effect of many moves, I use them mentally to recall the steps gained, but for nothing else. What he points to is that we mainly do not think in language, but record thought after the event in language. It is another example of the retrospective rather than the prospective aspect of the left hemisphere function. I have to say that though Galton is certainly right about certain kinds of thought, it is my experience that some branches of thought become fully formed only through their elaboration in language. So while language is neither necessary nor sufficient for thought, it nonetheless often plays an important part in the process, if its effect can also be obstructive. It provides necessary resistance. Necessary resistance. Necessary resistance. His other point is more telling, using example from his favorite activities, which include both inventing and mending mechanical contrivances, tools and mechanisms, playing billiards and chess, indulging in fencing, climbing and scrambling. He makes it clear that bodily movement itself, not language, is the key element in most of our thoughtful interactions with the world. With the world, with the world. And he carries on to emphasize that even reasoning emerges from motion. Even reasoning emerges from motion. He refers to Binet's La psychologie du raisonnement, published the previous year, which had emphasized the important part played by visual and motile as well as audible imagination in the act of reasoning. In the act of reasoning. As well as to numerous instances of thought depending on an active embodied engagement with the scene involving movement. Certainly not on any form of words. Any form of words. Any form of words. I'll put a pause there. 2044. I would start with a little illustration here, and that's the Gibsonian idea of seeing. According to J.J. Gibson, the inventor of the neologism affordance or affordances, seeing is never static, you never stand still, you move about. And when you are looking forward, walking briskly, for instance, everything will be, so to speak, distorted from their original static, or how could you say, disjunct form. Gibson says that cannot be so. Motion must be the primordial, must be the real, and the static as some sort of representation or construct. Everything is constantly moving, and therefore it's nonsensical to say that first you see this distorted vision of the world when you look and you move about, and then your brain sorry, calculate that into Cartesian or Newtonian absolutes, objects somewhere. I'd say that makes little, if any, sense. And it defies what we really experience in life, what is real. I think that could help to add substance. And now I go to the page 978. At the top of the page, we can go to the page maybe. And here is an importance. If you have pure repetition, you don't get opposites. But if you have an iteration rather, as you have in fractality, you get this resistance as well. And here is an example in the very beginning. Vortex is such a tension between opposing forces, specifically centripetal and centrifugal forces. And thus it both separates and combines, does two things at the same time. We go to the next paragraph under the subtitle, The Primacy of Motion over Stasis. The third line here. However, if the continuous and the moving is best appreciated by the right hemisphere, the discrete and static is best represented by the left hemisphere. And here you also see a lovely reference to quantum mechanics, wave and particle, which are complementary. But there is a primacy of union over division, as we can see in the next paragraph. However necessary division might be, is reflected in the fact that one can move from an extended whole in space or time to parts, but not from the parts to the whole. And I do like the Leibnizian site here. I'm going to read that site. I believe where there are only entities through aggregation, there will not even be real entities. To be brief, I hold as axiomatic that what is not truly one entity is not truly one entity either. That is no entity. Emphasis on entity. Everything comes as wholes. They are together, not constructed from lesser things, mechanically repeated. See repetition here. You can compare atoms to bigger things, and you compare seconds to bigger time. If you put them into seconds, you defy the very motion that time is. If you put them into atom, you defy the motion what a thing is. Always different in itself enough. No need for any reduction to explain or showing its true nature or anything like that. The true nature is already in the wholeness. It can be in no other place. It's the wholeness that it is. And Xenon tried to even cut away time, to put it into small pieces. Should we remember from Zeno's paradox? The top on page 979, like this one. It does not mean that it cannot be retrospectively divided. In retrospect, after, you can divide it. But such a division can apply only to the representation, not to the entity itself, whose essence is change, motion, and flow. So it's only in a posterior take. And compare that being outside of the universe. Here we are sort of being outside of time. It can serve its purpose as a representation, but not ever, ever to be mistaken for reality. And that is emphasized even more 5 lines down. For once time or motion is retrospected on, listen now, it is no longer time or motion. As fast, as quick as it is retrospected, it is no longer time nor motion. There you got it. If you go further down on the page, it will be even more broadened. As a defining quality of all living things is that they move purposely, growth being a form of motion. And we have seen that in order merely to remain in existence, they need constantly to change. So now it's taken over by motion from the animals and plants as well. They do move. That is what it is to be alive. The very directionality is life. It's not a mechanical after effect. It is truly there. It is alive. We grow, that's a directionality. Our will is our growth line. How we will something, our intention. is our development, our life. It cannot be separable from what we are. We are not an existence plus intention. We are as much existence as we have intention. And at the bottom here, the last paragraph, earlier I considered a particular kind of motion which followed logically from the discussion of time, namely the notion of flow and how it represents both continuity and discontinuity together. That's the most important thing here. It comes together in union. And here we have motion and cognition. It's getting more and more interesting. And we have this with language. And there is a point here. Afterwards, everything turns into language. Once we had a thought, we translate it into language, not before. And there is a sort of mixture between language and thinking as well, which is mentioned by McGilchrist himself, that they can provide necessary resistance, as you see at the end of this third paragraph, I think. So they can be in language, but the after effect could be only in language, but it's a sort in retrospectively. So the flow of thinking can contain thoughts in language, but they are still flowing, but a sort of after effect, a photo, a photo of the whole thing. Once it's done, will be a representation from the left hemisphere and not good enough to think with. Okay, I end here. I say thank you very much for participating. Have a very pleasant morning, day, or afternoon, wherever you are. Bye bye for now.